Note the image in this newspaper article published by a Baltimore newspaper in November of 1920. November 29th, very nearly 100 years ago, next month. The images of John Broadus Watson, the famous behaviorist at the time who had achieved a national reputation as one of the founders of the behavioral movement, which is by now familiar to everybody, and is in its third wave, or maybe even its fourth wave. Watson is depicted here, bespectacled, having been sued, it's reported, for absolute divorce by his wife. And there was a lot of controversy at the time surrounding this suit for divorce. In those days, you would file a lawsuit to sue your partner to divorce them. And the controversy led to John Watson's resignation from Johns Hopkins, which then was a major university as it is today. Now, there are several important features about this case that marked the end of Watson's meteoric rise as the founder of the behavioral movement. And several of them are described in this article, and I'm going to touch on a few of those. But I want to make a couple of points at this juncture, and that is to say that it was a profound ending to what had been a brilliant and a remarkable career that began by 1913 with the publication of two articles, A and B, that laid out the foundation for behaviorism and attacked and demolished the previous movement in American psychology, the introspectionist movement. John Watson did all of that, accomplished all of that within a year or two. By 1920, he had also published a famous paper that was the first, or one of the first, if not the first, to show a linkage between learning and emotion. So behavioral learning and emotion was demonstrated by John Watson by 1920. So prior to his resignation, he had published those papers. Now, I want to put into evidence, I'll play detective a little here, and put into evidence John Watson's actual letter of resignation. It comes from the archives at Johns Hopkins, and I obtained it through a friend of a friend who worked there. I asked them if they could retrieve his letter, if it existed, first of all, and if they could retrieve it from the archives, and sure enough, here it is. And I want to make a couple of points about this letter. First of all, it's addressed to President Goodnow, who is the then president of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. And it opens by saying, "My dear Dr. Goodnow," implying that the two were friends, and they knew each other quite well. And John Watson had brought a lot of renown to this university through his tenure in psychology. But what's interesting about this letter to me are two things. One is its abruptness. It's a very terse resignation letter, and it was inscribed, "I hereby tender my resignation as professor of psychology to the Johns Hopkins University to take immediate effect. Respectfully, John B. Watson." So that's interesting, just how abrupt the letter is. And there's some background to that. John had written another letter to Goodnow that was more lengthy, and that was more searching, and that was more probing, for a reason as to why he was going to be tendering his resignation. The second thing that interests me is the stationery on which this letter is written. It's the president's office, stationery. And if I do a little detective work here, I have to ask myself, didn't John Watson, who was the chair of psychology and one of the most famous psychologists in America, didn't he have his own stationery on which he might have composed a resignation letter? And the answer has got to be yes, he did. But he didn't write it on his stationery. He wrote it on the president's. And that to me suggests not only an abruptness to Watson's resignation, but perhaps some pressure and perhaps some duress under which he composed this very brief note of resignation. And I'm going to say more about that and give more background by way of this newspaper article that was published. And to say that it was the controversy surrounding this divorce that was a big part and a big push for John Watson's resignation. And you can see a subheading in the letter that has something to do with it. And it says, obtained letters by ruse. What does that mean? Well, and then I want you to look at a subheading to the article. Rosalie is the only name by which the alleged co-respondent is known by the news in the newspapers. Rosalie was John Watson's mistress. Rosalind Rainier was his mistress. They had done research together at Johns Hopkins, some of it quite famous. But this other part of it is really spectacular in what it suggests about how Watson's career came to its end. His wife had come to know about the affair, and she befriended John Watson's mistress. She'd befriended Rosalie. At the time, became friends. And on one occasion, she was visiting Rosalind's apartment, and she lured Rosalind out of the apartment. And she, Watson's wife, Mrs. Watson, while Rosalie was away, she went into her boudoir and searched around and found the love letters that John Watson had written to Rosalie. And portions of those letters, fragments of those letters, are published in this very newspaper article. And as you can see, this became a scandal as a result of his wife probing and befriending Rosalie, but more importantly, perhaps, John Watson's wife was a member of a powerful newspaper publishing family during that era. And I suspect what happened is that family threatened Hopkins with publishing more about the affair and exposing it in the newspapers. And that, in turn, put pressure on the president, Dr. Goodnow, and he put pressure on John to resign. So that's one story that Bob Bowles, the great animal behaviorist at the University of Washington, tells in his book, The Story of Psychology, about how all of this could have happened, how John Watson could have lost so much in terms of his fame and his career in such a short time. How he could have gone from being the leading academic in the field of behavioral psychology to being out of a job where nobody in academia would hire him following this incident. And so it's a catastrophe for Watson, who was devastated by it, but who would pick himself up and who would launch a second career in the field of advertising. John Watson, as it happened, became one of the original madmen by going to New York City and launching for himself a second, more lucrative career in advertising. So he left Johns Hopkins in this scandalous episode, but he landed on his feet in a sense by going to New York City and launching a career in commercial advertising. I'll tell you more about his career in the next segment.